Hey guys, so this will be the second video of the channel, and I hope also the first video of a series of videos that I want to do on how to assess pharma stocks. No, in the first part of the video, I will basically will go over some very basic concepts of how the pharma industry works, and then in the second part of the video, we'll look at different pharma companies, compare some metrics across them, and try to get to some conclusions on how to identify pharma companies that could be good investments in the future. Okay, so first of all, no, the first distinction that we need to make when we talk about pharma companies, it's the difference between branded pharma companies, which it's most of them, and generic pharma companies. So what do we mean by branded pharma companies? Branded pharma companies are the ones that mostly sell protected drugs that are protected by a patent. No, so this is Novartis, Pfizer, the ones that you usually know about. And then generic pharma companies are the ones that specialize in selling the drugs that have already that are of patent. No, so which patent has expired, and therefore anyone can sell that product. And just to be clear, most of all the analysis that I will do here, it's only for branded pharma companies. Okay, so I think it's worth understanding what are patents. No? So patents are basically recipes on, in this case, of how to make a certain drug and that have a certain life and expiration date. Usually, for pharma patents, the duration is 20 years in registration, and during these 20 years, you are the only company that is able to sell the drug protected by your patent, no? Basically. And after these 20 years, theoretically, everyone else can start producing the same product and selling it. So as you can imagine, this creates some unique business dynamics, no? Because during the life of the patent, you have no competitors, so you can sell the product at basically not any price you want, because you have to negotiate this, as we will see later, but without any price pressure from competitors. And usually, this means that you'll have a very high margin or high gross margin on this product, which is what usually see, if you compare the gross margin of different industries, you will notice that for pharma companies, they will have probably one of the highest gross margins compared to other industries. But yeah, why do patents exist? No, because if we look at the graph on the screen, usually bringing a drug to market, so from having identified a certain molecule to actually start selling it into US, Europe, or whatever market, it takes a lot of money. No, it's super expensive and takes a lot of time, and it's very hard. So basically, patents exist so pharma companies can have time to recover the initial investment they did to bring this drug to the market, and therefore promote innovation. No, because if you spend billions in getting a drug approved into the market, and then the next day everyone else can start producing the same drug, and the prices go to, I don't know, to a very low gross margin, then it's very hard that you can get a return on investment on all that money that you have spent. No, so patents are basically there so pharma companies can get a return on this investment, and not only on the investment that for the drugs that got to market, but for all the other ones that failed to get to market. No, so you need to account for all the drugs that at some point in the process failed because of a clinical trial something went wrong, they were not able to show efficacy for that certain disease, and so on. And this also costs money. No, so it's not only all the investment that the pharma company has made to get that certain drug into the market, but for all the other failed attempts that they did. No, so it needs to be worth it for them. And most importantly, as you can see in the graph, the patent registration happens at the very early stage of the process. No, so for most of the patent life, which is, as we said, 20 years, you are not generating revenue. Usually, as a rule of thumb, it can take 10 years to get the drug to the market, to registration. So it means that you will only be able to sell the drug for, let's say, to sell the drug at a nice profit for around 10 years. And this explains why the gross margins are so high, no? Because you really need to um, get a return on investment on that money that you have spent before, and it's not that simple to do that. So, and maybe it's even useful to think about pharma companies as venture capital funds, no? Because they need to invest money in so many different bets and molecules in the hope that one of them will get approved and get to the market, and that one that gets approved and gets to the market needs to pay off for all the other failed molecules and bets they did, no? Um, and the return on investment that they are able to get on this will very much affect the company performance in the long term, no? So the yield that they get on a certain drug profit divided by all the money that they have spent before, it's what basically will very much dictate the company performance in the long term. Um, so pharma companies in a way are like investment funds, no? They depend very much on capital allocation decisions, which are usually depending on management of the company. And this is actually one of the reasons that many investors, including Warren Buffett, are not super keen of investing in the pharma space, no? Because instead of having a very clear mode, most of them depend on good management decisions and capital allocation decisions. And this is something that I mean, you can get a good streak of decisions, but in the long term, in the very long term, it's not a super reliable competitive mode. And actually, this brings me to my next point, no? Which is if we look at most pharma companies that have remained in business in the last decades, most of them are serial acquirers, no? Because when it comes to bringing new drugs to the market, pharma companies basically have two ways to do it. One of them is to invest in internal research and development and go from 0 to 1 and bring that drug to the market from all the process, and the other is acquire an existing drug from another company, no? And it's very common for large pharma to outsource a lot of this process by acquiring small biotech, small pharma companies, or assets from other big companies, no? And as we can see in this extract from a McKinsey report, most of the companies that remained active, no, and operative and independent in the last decades are very big acquirers, because in reality there is not any other option for a pharma company to remain in business. They need to be constantly launching new assets into the market, new drugs that keep the cash flow ongoing, no? And we can see as an example on the right side of the screen that this is an example of the revenues, or real drug revenues, and what happens when expiration of the patent hits the drug, no? So probably at this point, many other generic companies started launching similar versions of this drug, and therefore the revenues of this branded drug declined substantially. At this point, obviously, the pharma company kept producing the drug after patent expiration, but still revenues decreased substantially, and probably margins are also much lower in this case. So as we can see, when a drug loses its patent protection, the sales go much lower or even to zero. So to summarize, on a broad level, pharma companies' long-term performance depends very much on the quality of their capital allocation decisions, no? And this can be done either by acquiring existing drugs or by investing in internal research and development. And I think now we can jump to the next point, which is how drug prices are set and how this affects pharma company margins, no? So drug prices are usually set by by negotiation between pharma companies and payers. No, payers are basically either private healthcare insurance companies or national healthcare systems. Um, However, depending on the geography, pharma companies, as we can see, um, have a much higher leverage to negotiate than in other countries. So, as you can imagine, in the US, which it's the biggest pharma market in the world, pharma companies have a lot of leverage to negotiate drug prices. And this is because their payer market is fragmented compared to Europe or Japan, no, in this example, because instead of having a single national healthcare system, depending on the government, they have many different private healthcare insurance companies, and then also separately the two famous government programs, which are Medicaid and Medicare. And even though there were some changes recently, as you can see in the right, for Medicare and Medicaid, where they tried to negotiate lower prices for best-selling drugs. Usually, since there is no central negotiator and insurance companies can negotiate a bit, but there are certain laws that limit their power, drug prices in the US are quite high. No? For example, I think Medicare must cover at least 2 drugs per therapeutic area, per therapeutic class. So this means that if there is not at least 2 drugs approved for a certain therapeutic class, they need to approve the drug almost at, let's say, whatever the cost. No. So I think unless there is some big consolidation in the US as a payer market, the situation will remain the same, and basically the US will still be the biggest pharma market in the world. On the contrary, in Japan and Europe and in probably the rest of the world, what happens is the private healthcare insurance companies are not really a thing, and there is a single payer, which is the government, and therefore there is a much strong negotiating power. No? So either you get reimbursed by the government, or you don't get reimbursed, and basically you don't have sales in that country. So these countries, no, most Europe and Japan, are able to get lower prices for the drugs, which in turn means lower margins for the pharma company. And I think that's most of it. I think probably another thing that it's worth discussing. It's obviously there are other factors, that it's not only the leverage that a pharma company has in different countries, but governments and payers mainly look at 2 different things when they are setting the price. No, one of them is the alternatives that exist in a certain therapeutic area. No, so for example, if a drug that helps patients in a certain therapeutic area that do not have any other kind of treatment available, and this is called an orphan drug, the pharma company can claim a higher price on that drug usually, because there is no other therapeutic option for the patients. If in turn there are many other options in that therapeutic area, so already there are many drugs approved for that disease, the price that you can claim it's probably lower or not so high. And then the other important factor is that it's expected benefit, no? Obviously for the patients. So if you have a drug that extends the life of certain cancer patients by 6 months, and you have another one that extends that same life expectancy by 20 years, then obviously the one that will have a higher reimbursed price will be the one that has 20 years. No? And I'm exaggerating to make the point, obviously, but these are the 2 main factors. No? It's like the expected benefit for the patients and the alternative therapeutic options for that same patient. These are probably the 2 most relevant factors when it comes to decide the reimbursement price of a drug in a certain country. I think that's it. The next point that it's worth looking into and I'm showing this very basic graph, no? It's that even though manufacturing costs are usually very low across all pharma companies, uh, especially in comparison to the reimbursed prices that they're able to get, I think it's worth reviewing um, how different types of therapies affect the production costs, no? So usually the more complex therapy, the higher the production cost. Um, Here we have different examples, but I would divide them into three groups. Basically, one is small molecules, the other one is biomolecules, so anything from nu nucleic acid therapeutics to antibodies, and then the third group would be advanced therapies. So it would be basically cell and gene therapies. And let's start with the simple one, which is small molecules. Now, small molecules are basically these are chemical entities that are very simply produced by bulk chemical reactions. No? So the cost of manufacturing, it's basically super low. And probably a good example of a small molecule that everyone knows, it's aspirin. No? Um, then in the second group, as we said, we have all the biomolecules, which go from nucleic acid therapeutics to antibodies. No? These are more complex molecules to manufacture and cannot be simply produced usually by chemical reactions, but you usually need live cells or microorganisms to produce them, making them much more expensive to be produced than small molecules. However, since they are usually more effective, they can command a higher reimbursement price than small molecules, and therefore the margins are still quite high usually. I mean, a good example of a it's called biomolecule therapy, would be most of the new cancer therapies. No? So most of the new cancer therapies are antibody-based technology, and this means usually that these therapies are less toxic and more effective since they are much more targeted to cancer cells than small molecules. Another typical small molecule is the traditional chemotherapy, which is first line of treatment for cancer patients. And this is basically a drug that kills most cells regardless of whether they are cancerous or not. No? So antibodies are much more targeted, less toxic, and therefore usually more effective than traditional chemotherapy. Also, obviously, they are more complex to produce, more complex to discover also, and therefore the reimbursement price it's quite high, and that's why traditional chemotherapy is still being used in combination with this, which is a standard of care for many cancers. And then the third group, it's advanced therapies, no? And advanced therapies, this is still something very new, but includes cell and gene. Basically, I would say the most important ones are cell and gene therapies, no? And these are actually either living organisms that you modify, so living cells that you modify and reinsert in your body, or virus-based therapies that modify existing cells in your body, no? And these are really complex to discover, really complex to produce, and also still very rare. So there's only a few that have been approved, and this is state-of-the-art technology. Usually, one of these therapies could go from $500,000 at least for some cancer cell-based therapies, and are not usually first line of treatment. This is for patients that do not respond to the more simpler therapies. And as you can see, I think one of the things that it's worth noting is that the more complex the biomolecule, obviously it's harder to manufacture, but this also means that it's harder to copy. No? So once the patent expires, even when the patent expires, it's not so easy to copy a recipe that it's so complex. No? So it would be interesting to see what happens when the patent for cell and gene therapy based therapies expires, because I don't think it's even if you can manufacture them, there are so many nuances in the manufacturing process that it's not. I don't think it would be so easy to copy. So it's an additional barrier of defense that we will see how this plays out in the future, because most of these are still on patent. Um, and if generic versions of these are possible. Also, just as something that I think it's important to know, the generic version of biomolecules are usually called biosimilars. Just a naming thing, but that's the what is known in the space. Then from a financial perspective, I mean, we said that the more complex the molecule, the harder it is to manufacture. No? So some of these we will see it reflected in the capex investment that these companies needs to make, and the property, plant, and equipment items on their balance sheets. I think that's it on this point. Now let's jump to the last item that I want to talk about before looking into some specific examples. And this is the sales and marketing costs and expenditure of pharma companies. And I think it's worth talking about this because, as you can see, it's a very relevant item in the income statements. And even it's higher than what they spend on R&D investment. No? So they actually, pharma companies spend more on sales and marketing expenditure than on internal research. And you can ask, why is that, no? And I would say there are mainly two reasons for this. One, it's basically just a consequence of the fact that, as we said, drugs usually have very high margins, no? So you are able to still spend a big percentage, a big amount of money on marketing and still turn a profit, no? And be profitable and keep selling. But probably the most important factor, and the second one, is that, as we said at the beginning, you will only be selling these for a certain amount of years, no? And you want to maximize as much as possible how much money you get during these years. So you basically want to scale up sales operations and marketing as fast as possible. And this is why they spend so much money on this also, no? And especially because when a drug gets approved and reimbursed, no, it doesn't mean that the doctors automatically know that it exists. Probably most of them won't know yet, no? So there's a lot of effort that you need to do to let doctors know about your drug, and this implies hiring a lot of sales representatives that goes to the doctor, explains them about the existence, no, first of all, of your drug that has been newly approved, and in many cases why your drug it's better than other alternatives in the market, because they may not be aware of the studies you've made, that you showed higher efficacy than this other drug that it's being sold by your competitor in the market, no? So this requires a lot of actual marketing and promotional spending that you need to scale as fast as possible to maximize your return on investment on that asset, no? And in the US, I think it's also worth noting that you can market directly to patients through social media, TV ads, and so on. This is forbidden in the rest of the world. I think the only other country besides the US that you can directly market a prescription drug to patients, it's New Zealand. But that also increases the capacity you have to do marketing expenditure, because it's another, obviously, a whole other channel that you can leverage to let the patient know about your drug, and then the patient goes to the doctor and says, hey, should we try this drug that they've seen on TV, no? So this also works. Okay, so let's do a quick recap of everything we discussed so far. So basically, the first thing we discussed is that drug sales depend very much on the patent life, and that pharma company performance is therefore tied to capital allocation, and how much they pay to get a drug to the market, either through acquisition or internal research and development, uh, and how much that drug generates in revenues when it gets to market, basically dictates the long-term performance of the pharma company. Then the second thing we discussed is that reimbursement prices of the drug are directly affect the margins of pharma companies, obviously, and the capacity to negotiate these reimbursed prices changes by one country to the other, being the US the biggest market. Whilst it's also dependent on other factors like what are the alternative therapies for that same patient population and the expected improvement versus current therapies already in the market or just in general for patients. Then the third point that we have seen is that there are different types of therapies that can affect the gross margins and capex expenditure of companies. But also, the more complex the therapy, probably the harder it is to copy for generic companies, and that offers like additional protection when the patent expires. And then finally, we have seen that promotion and marketing costs are also super relevant for pharma companies, usually exceeding research and development expenditure. And this is something we need to take into account when we look at different pharma companies.